American Vision presents Meet with the Speakers.
Speaking today with Dr. Gary North and his new video series, The History of the Conservative Movement, which will be in two parts. The first 8 will be on the first set of DVDs, and then the second 7 will be on another series, total of 15. These are in 30-minute segments. It's in addition to the video part of all this, we've included a number of very hard to find conservative books as well. Dr. North, you've been involved in the conservative movement from a very young age. I mean, most of us get into this probably after college, and maybe after we have children. We see how much is being taken out of our taxes, and we see these greater regulations. But you really got started in this really, really early.
Yes, I would date my systematic entrance into the conservative movement as 1956.
Now, in 1956, you're still a teenager.
Yes, that's
a teenager.
Right. That's right. And I was probably about 14 or 15 years old. The motivating factor with me, more than any other single factor, was a presentation that I heard by a physician out of Australia named Fred Schwartz. Schwartz had devoted his career by that time for over a decade to exposing the rise of communist ideology, systematic study of Marxist-Leninism, and warning individuals that this was a worldwide ideological conflict which was being ignored, as far as he was concerned, by the West. Even though there was the big buildup of weaponry, he saw the battle as ideological and moral. And he said there the West does not appear to be winning. So he was out to warn people about this confrontation, which he saw as ethical and religious. He had an organization called the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade. And as a result of really one lecture, I was convinced he was correct. And so I began reading original Marxist material at the time, reading the recommended books and articles that he recommended. And I came across a magazine called The Freeman, which was a libertarian magazine which had only been published by that time, really that year. It began publishing in 1956, and I began reading it either at 56 or 57. So in that respect, I came from an anti-communist side, and I also came from a libertarian economic side. I did not start reading National Review until I got to college. So my background was much more tied to ideas than it was tied to anything like political action.
Now, I mean, again, following this all from the 1950s, and you've been in the middle of all this, and very early on, you mentioned the Freeman. What other publications in say the 1950s? You also mentioned National Review. What else? What was out there? What was available to conservatives back in the 1950s and early 1960s?
You really have to talk about the second half of the 50s. The Freeman began publication on a systematic basis in 56. National Review began in 55. Prior to that, everything was sporadic. There were some newsletters. Human Events was a newsletter that people read. There was a newsletter put out by a very effective anti-communist and conservative named Dan Smoot, the Dan Smoot Report. He was very effective, and in fact was the only national figure I knew who had his own television show. It was not, of course, in those days videotaped. It was shot on film, and it was paid for broadcasting on local stations around the United States. So if you had any conservative figure who was surely conservative, there was only one national figure, and we forget.
Yeah, right.
And that was Bishop Sheen.
And I remember watching Bishop Sheen on TV, and he just stood up there. I think he had a chalkboard.
He had a blackboard and a piece of chalk, and that was it. And in that respect, he was the Glenn Beck of the day. And he showed that effective presentation from a charismatic individual who was well grounded in the basics in front of a camera with very low technology could have an enormous impact. There were some nights in which his audience was larger than Milton Berle's, and Berle was called at the time Mr. Television. And some nights he would be outpulled by Sheen. So,
and Sheen is a Catholic bishop.
A Catholic bishop. He was certainly a traditional values man. He was strongly anti-communist. He was well trained in basic communist ideology. He was the Catholic version of Fred Schwartz. And he was just as effective as Schwartz was, and probably more effective for a mass audience. So in that respect, while he was not a political operative, and he was not moving individuals into any kind of political affirmation or mobilization, he was the one figure that you saw nationally on a regular basis who would present what we would call a conservative moral and religious outlook.
Now, if you go back to the 50s and the 60s, though, there was kind of a general moral consensus. We didn't have the type of moral division in the United States as we have today, like with what Glenn Beck is doing and dealing with kind of a revisionist version of history. And I remember Sheen and growing up in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with a Catholic and Irish and Jewish and Polish and Ukrainian, Czechoslovakian. There was this moral consensus among all of us. And so Sheen kind of had an audience that pretty much agreed with him.
Yes, that's correct. We were not a church-going family at the time, and yet my mother would watch it and my dad would watch it. He was an anti-communist FBI agent, so he did appreciate Sheen's position on the anti-communism. So we would watch that, and I can remember the JMJ, and I said, what does that mean? And my mother knew it was Jesus, Mary, Joseph. He would always put the JMJ, essentially it's a logo is what it was, at the bottom of the blackboard when he would finish a presentation. So I was aware of him, though having no connection in any regular way with any church, and certainly not a Catholic church. So he spoke from a moral value standpoint to America. But he was not the only one. If you look at the movies prior to 1960, from the heyday of the movies from, say, 1935, 36, that period through 1960, those movies had a basic worldview which was moral. And if there was any hint of adultery in that movie, somebody, probably the woman, was going to fall on bad times before that movie had ended. And the Jews who ran Hollywood, who were secularists in their outlook, and they were just guys making a whole lot of money, they fully understood Protestant America.
Yeah, they understood their audience.
Absolutely, they understood it. And they were not going to cross that audience with some kind of flagrant activity on the screen that in any way challenged the system. And of course, it is ludicrous in retrospect in that you could not have a double bed with married couples. And at all times, one of them or both, if on screen, had to have one foot on the floor. So it went to a ludicrous...
I mean, the I Love Lucy show, I mean, this whole pregnancy thing with Lucille Ball, I mean, that was really a big deal.
That was a big deal.
Never understood it because women get pregnant all the time, but on television it was a...
So that world is truly gone, and it is remarkable how fast that world disappeared. So Glenn Beck is playing catch-up. There's no question about it. He is appealing to a narrower segment of the population than Sheen did, and he cannot come and have the same success in getting that message out that Sheen had, because the moral consensus that existed in 1955 no longer exists.
We come back in our next segment. I want to deal with some of the major figures of the conservative movement that you might not have heard about. In addition to that, some of the publications that really had an impact on the conservative movement.
The History of the Conservative Movement, featuring Dr. Gary North, from the first Tea Party to the contemporary Tea Parties. Now available at AmericanVision.com.